QSO Today, episode 383, Vince Dione, VE6LK. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might ask, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is returning on May 12th, Greenwich time, with new presentations and some very interesting ways to meet in virtual person integrated into our VFairs platform. If you create and sell products to the amateur radio community, become an exhibitor at the expo. There is no easier way to get your products and brand in front of 6,000 plus fellow hams. Please contact me for more information. Vince Dione, VE6LK, has taken hold of the amateur radio opportunities on HF single sideband, VHF-UHF mobile operation, repeater building and maintenance, and supporting events with his Calgary-based amateur radio club. Vince is a regular contributor to the bi-weekly Ham Radio Workbench Podcast and made a presentation at the last QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo on disaster communications and leadership imperatives for radio amateurs. VE6LK is my QSO Today. VE6LK, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Vince?
I am. You're 5 and 9, full quieting.
Vince, and you are too, with a beautiful video signal coming in from Canada. Vince, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
We can. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, Eric. I grew up in a home where my dad, a carpenter, loved fixing TVs and stereos. And so the smell of solder smoke goes back a long way. And he introduced us, his cousin Al, VE3AND, came to visit. And we called him Uncle Al. And Al said to us, well, I'm a ham radio operator. So we got interested in what that was, myself, my older brother. And we had an old shortwave radio. And Al started tuning around and showed us a few things about shortwave radio. And that's really when it began. I have this really distinct memory. I was about 7 years old at the time. So that's really the genesis of when it began. I was 18, and I finally sat the Canadian exam where I had to hand draw schematics and block diagrams and answer theoretical questions. By then, I had gone through high school as an electronics student with a hope that didn't pan out to be an electronics technologist later in life. My math wasn't strong enough. But anyway, the exam, I met the office downtown, the Department of Communications in 1980, and I passed the test. It wasn't terribly difficult for me, but given my background, that makes sense.
What's the hometown?
Hamilton, Ontario.
Hamilton, Ontario was your hometown, but the current QTH is not in Ontario.
It's in Okotoks, Alberta, and that is just south of the big city of Calgary. So I moved here in 1997 for my employer.
So for people that don't know Canada, you've taken a major shift to the west.
2 time zones at least. Yep.
You're on the east side of the Rocky Mountains?
I am on the east side of the Rocky Mountains. If I drive about 30 minutes to the west, I am in the Rocky Mountains, towering mountains around me, beautiful countryside.
But Hamilton, Ontario, which is your hometown, is actually a suburb of Toronto, as I recall, and it's kind of on the water?
The Hamiltonians might bristle at the thought that they're a suburb of Toronto. They're about 40 miles or 60 kilometers away, a distinct city on its own, right at the western tip of Lake Ontario. And we refer to that area as the Golden Horseshoe. At the bottom end of it, geographically, is Niagara Falls, a beautiful area, 7 wonders of the world. At the western tip is Hamilton, and at the northern tip of that horseshoe is the Toronto area.
Niagara Falls is on both sides of the border?
It is. The river straddles the Canada-U.S. border, so there's falls on both sides. And the falls that most people see a picture of are the Horseshoe Falls, which is on the Canadian side of the border.
So if you want the best view of Niagara Falls, you need to go to Canada.
I'm told. I have not seen the Canadian Falls from the American side.
So after Uncle Al about amateur radio and how to tune around on shortwave, as a child, where did that lead you? Were you building electronic kits? Was your dad supplying you with parts and goodies from the television sets that he liberated?
My dad was a phenomenal recycler of parts, and he would tear down old electronics and throw the capacitors in a box and the resistors in a box and the neon bulbs and signal lamps and everything else. And so we could build without what we wanted to. Somehow a straight key, a fairly inexpensive one on Bakelite plastic, found its way into the collection. And I remember, building the circuit with a battery and turning the light on and off at one point. But we were encouraged to wisely use the solder and build what we needed, sure.
Now, the education system in Canada, does it resemble more what the Europeans do? Meaning, are you tracked, once you leave junior high school through high school, either for college prep or some kind of like industrial arts track?
There is an industrial arts track that starts as young as 11 years of age, grade 5, and you can start to take shop classes. They are offered. You can take home ec classes, the old model of male and female biased education, if you will. So it does start that young, yeah. And I started following that track. I took the wood shops because Dad was a carpenter, and I wanted to learn more about the proper way to handle tools. And he showed me what he could based on the tools he had around the house. He didn't have a lathe or a drill press or anything, but we didn't want for anything else. He had a good selection of tools, of course.
You said you had an interest in electronics through high school. Didn't go that direction because of the math. Sadly, I think I talked to a lot of ham radio operators who are quite accomplished who couldn't get through the math either.
The math was very difficult for me. I took 4 years of electronics in high school. I took some drafting and I took some machine shop. And some industrial electrical. The math, however, eluded me. I took 6 maths and I landed up with 2 credits. So with her grade 10 math, which was not strong enough to get into the collegiate level of doing electronics, I found myself in cinematography, film and radio arts for almost 1 year.
How did that play out?
Only in my dream. No, it didn't play out at all commercially. I never finished that first year. Life got in the way, and I left for the working world. It landed me up. I parlayed my electronic skills into the then burgeoning computer industry, helping to build Apple clones and IBM clones in the retail side, on the service side of the world. And this new thing called computer networks kind of caught my eye. And, well, there's a little bit of RF that travels on the cable in some of these networks at that time. Today it's all twisted pair. Anyway, that's it kind of spurned me on into working as a technologist in IT for most of my career.
Now, let's go back to the license. You say you were 18 years old in, 1980 when you got your first license?
That's when I attempted my first license. And the other half of it was 7 words a minute Morse code. And at 18, leaving high school, entering college, social pressures were more interesting than doing Morse code, it seems. I struggled with Morse then. I struggle with it today. I never did finish my license in 1980. So if we fast wind the tape ahead to 2002, after I've moved out to Western Canada, I finally got my license then, and there's kind of a fun story in behind that. But it took me some time to find the time with work demands and family demands to actually get my ticket many years after I first wanted to.
Where did you go to college?
I went to college in Hamilton, to Mohawk College. It's still there today.
Reminds me of a haircut.
Yes, it reminds me of a haircut too.
Did they have at least a pretty good basketball team?
I have no idea if they had a basketball team. Sports is something other people do.
What did you study at Mohawk College?
That's where I took radio and television arts and film arts. It was a production-based course, a sampling of anything one can do in radio and TV. At the time, 16-millimeter film was on its way out, being replaced by this brand new thing called electronic news gathering, which really meant direct-to-videotape. So that's about the era. Smaller cameras were starting to be the thing, probably around 20 pounds instead of 80 pounds. So we learned all about that stuff. In high school, I was the theater kid. A group of us were talking the other day, and all 5 of us put up our hands because we were all either the AV or the theater kid in school. And so this seemed to be a kind of a natural extension to that.
Yeah, I was. We'd rolled 16-millimeter projectors around to the classrooms.
Yep.
We were all kind of nerdy, I think.
Yeah, and we still are in many ways.
For live theater, we were lighting, sound, and the fly gallery.
Yeah, the fly gallery. The fly gallery had a fond memory for me. Apparently, I let go of the rope when I shouldn't have once. But the fly gallery survived. We didn't have to redo any of the ropes and pulleys. Oh, well.
Those are the things that make stories, right?
Yep. I disremembered that until you asked just now.
Through that period of time, once you left Mohawk College, you got involved in IT, you were in the computer business. How did that go for you?
IT has been a tremendous career for me. I've been very, very fortunate. My skills as a programmer don't exist. I know what I don't know, and programmers are what programming is what smart people do, as I'm known to say. I have no skill in that area. So as a technologist, I can hang boxes together and make them talk. I often tell people I'm a plumber. If their email is working, if they have access to the internet, then my work or my team's work today is largely done, and we're just in the background. We're the plumbers.
You deal with the macro, not the micro.
Yeah, sure. You bet.
You get this first license in 2002. Did you need any mentors or have any mentors then that helped you get that first license in 2002?
I had mentors before then, and I've never forgotten them. When I was about to write my test when I was 18, or I had tried to write my test somewhere around that part of my life, I had a job at McMaster University, and Don Brown, he's Silent Key now, VE6LK, took me under his wing, and we went out to a couple of flea markets together, and I found myself with my first radio without a license, an old Drake TR-22C, a 2-meter crystal controlled rig. And so he encouraged me along. Later in 2002, the night I wrote my exam, I met Dave Curry, now VE3RTL, living in Ontario. And Dave encouraged me to become more involved in the hobby and in the club at the time. And these people really strongly encouraged me. My dear friend, Dan St. Pierre, VE6TD, he and I came up in a similar way. We only met when I moved to Alberta, but he was encouraged as a child by family members, like I was, to follow his heart and look at ham radio. But like me, he didn't do anything with it in earnest until 2002. So he and I now live 926 feet apart, and there's a reason for that number. And we're constantly working on things together. So I would dare say those are my 3 most influential mentors.
At this point, all the listeners are going to say, let's just find out what that 926 feet is all about.
So you might have heard, and so as we're recording this in early 2022, you might have heard that there was a pandemic that swept the earth. And so because of that pandemic, it put a kibosh on many of our in-person activities, among them Field Day, Winter Field Day. And in the rules of Field Day and Winter Field Day, all of your transmitters must be located within a 1,000-foot circle. And at this time, there's this thing called Google Maps or Google Earth that gives you a reasonably accurate distance between 2 points on a map. And we happen to live very close. So just as a gag, I said to him one night, I wonder how far apart we are. I bet we could have the club station. And so we plotted a line on the map, and we're well within the 1,000-foot circle, 926 feet to be precise. And so now for our club's contests, his home and my home are the outer edges of the circle. There is a high school on public land in between us where we have permission to park stations. And we became the club station, and we host our field days over Zoom. And people come in on teleconference. We get people from all over the world coming in and cheering us on. We might have somebody working in our backyard or in our front driveway. But this is how we do field day, 926 feet.
So you could actually park on the street in the school and just between the two of you, and you actually could run multiple stations.
Bingo. And we have a microwave point-to-point between us. We can serve that microwave Wi-Fi network to others that need it, so that takes care of our logging. It overall started off as a joke, and it works really well.
And now this message from ICOM America. Now, after you've cleaned up your holiday decorations, admired the colorful socks and ties from your well-meaning significant others, it's time to get what you really wanted on your holiday wish list. Spice up your ham shack with ICOM's new ID52A handheld radio, now shipping. This radio is perfect for staying in or venturing out and working your favorite VHF and UHF channels this winter season. The ICOM ID52A is ICOM's newest handheld amateur radio that is VHF and UHF dual band with D-Star and FM dual mode functions. This radio supports conventional FM communications and D-Star, simplex, repeater mode, regional, and worldwide calls over the D-Star Internet Gateway. The ID52A is the first handheld amateur radio with a full-color 2.3-inch waterfall display and the ability to send photos over D-Star with a connected Android device. Other features include wideband receiver with guaranteed range of 144 to 148 MHz and 440 to 450 MHz. It has VV, UU, VU with dual DV mode. Integrated GPS GLONASS receiver including grid square locations, micro SD card slot, micro USB for data transfer, programming, and charging, and it's IPX7 waterproof. Can you believe it? For more information, please click on the ICOM banner ad in this week's show notes page at QSOtoday.com. So get that new radio that was missed on your list. And when you purchase your new ICOM ID52A or any other amazing ICOM radio or accessory, please tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO. Now you say you had the Drake TR22C. I haven't seen that radio in 40 years, I don't think. Was that your first radio, the Drake?
It was my first radio, and I never did get it on the air because I hung on to it. You know, I got it when I was 20, and when I was 40, I did my ticket in 02. And I remember walking into the radio store that was in Calgary at the time, and I said, hey, I need some crystals for this radio. I got my ticket, and I need to put this on the air. And the gentleman behind the counter, Nick, he looked at me and he said, crystals are hard to come by. We have to talk about this. And so I was introduced to the world of synthesized radios at that point, which I didn't think I had any budget for, but I found money.
Well, you probably could have made a synthesizer for that TR22. As I recall, I don't recall why they called it the 22. Was it because it was 2 meters, or did it have 22 crystal positions?
I have no idea. The radio didn't stay long with me. I learned that on eBay people would pay money for such things, so it was quickly sold to help fund my new hobby, if you will.
For newer hams, that Drake TR22 was a portable, but was actually like a mobile over the shoulder with a battery pack.
Yeah, and a 2-meter antenna that would screw into the connector, like a whip.
In the front panel. So the front panel was actually up under your arm. What was the call sign? Was it the same one you have now?
It is the same one I have now, and here in Canada we can hold multiple call signs, so I've retained it, and it's VE6 Victor Papa Delta. which is a terrible call sign. Phonetically, it's terrible non-phonetically. VE6VPD. As I give people examinations, I say, I'm going to give you an example of what you could choose to not do. Choose a call sign that sounds good on air, not like my first one.
Well, I can tell you what was worse. Sadly, my first call sign was WN6VHV. Try to do that on CW.
On CW, it's terrible. Non-phonetically, it's not bad.
I was happy to get rid of it. But I also see that you have an American call sign. Why do Canadian hams have American call sign?
I spent enough time down in the States that it made sense for me to get a U.S. call sign, if only for the times that I'm down there and I do wish to do contesting, because VE6LK stroke Whiskey 7 becomes difficult in a contest. People go, VE6LK? No, stroke Whiskey 7. Whiskey 7 Lima Kilo? It just becomes difficult. So I had a spare week of time down in the States where, I was visiting, but really we weren't planning on doing any day trips and such. I think I was down there without my spouse. And I just decided, well, I may as well write my extra while I'm down here. And that's what I did.
And what's the call sign?
AI7LK. So I kept the same suffix as I did in my two-lettered Canadian call, VE6LK. And so I hold both of those today.
What's your favorite operating mode?
Voice. Nice and simple. I play around with all the modes. I'm terrible at CW. I think I've established that fact quite well. I love playing in digital modes, but voice. And I really had trouble putting my finger on why until just recently. I was reading a bio from Golf 5 Delta Oscar Charlie, and he said, here's this quote, direct quote from QRZ. When I'm asked why I'm fascinated with radio when we have the internet, I don't talk about the constant surprise when I bounce a signal around the world at 10 watts, although just thinking about that sends a chill up my back. He says, I explain that audio carries emotion better than any other medium. And I'm like, yeah, I can totally get that. I can very much relate.
Now, are you a rag chewer?
No, I'm a contact maker. Or as George KJ6VU puts it, I'm more of a propagation ham. I build stuff and I get it on the air and then I move on. I work a lot of nets. I sometimes do net control on HF. I'm very big into public service, 6 to 12 events a year. I'm usually in net control or event logistics for that. I'm more bound to chew rags on Zoom than I am on the radio.
So you're a propagation ham. Does that mean that you're a builder of things?
I try to build things. I integrate more than I build. I'll take pre-packaged solutions and or prepackaged products and build them together to make a solution. I'm learning to build, but I never was great at electronics. I mean, that's the dirty secret. At least I don't think I was. I can't tell you the difference between a collector and an emitter. I just know I have to get the polarity right. I do know enough to not reverse polarize a resistor as I install it, as I jokingly tell people. But so my building skills, I have next to no design skills when it comes to circuitry, and I'd like to get better at that.
It seems to me that you're not afraid of kind of going there. I saw that you have a YouTube channel with a couple of videos on it. One of those is you're actually starting a circuit design, I think.
Yeah.
So you're not afraid to go out there and try it. What's that project that you're doing where you're actually putting it on YouTube?
I have to struggle to think about what I put on YouTube. It seems to me that I was building up a little station controller switch box for my shack here that would route the audio, split the audio routing into left and right earbuds or left and right ear cuffs of my headphones so that I could listen to an SDR on one side and my local audio on the other and balance the audio between them, handle my microphone input, handle my foot switch to trigger my little bitty on-air light when I transmit. Things of that nature to make my shack function better. That's where I tend to gravitate towards.
But when the video was on, it looked like your workbench was behind you and you actually have some test equipment. What's the most valuable piece of test equipment that you have on your bench? Valuable not in terms of money, but in terms of use.
One of my multimeters. I have an old Fluke 8010 bench meter that's permanently mounted above my bench. and it gets more use than any other piece of equipment in my shop. I have a small oscilloscope that I almost remember how to use from high school, and I fumble with it, but I can get a waveform on it, which is usually why I'm using it to check an audio signal as it's chasing through a radio. I have available to me 2 service monitors. They're from the club. They live just around the corner in another room in the basement here. But really, a decent multimeter is the number one tool a guy should carry if he's doing any sort of repair work. And so I often think of myself as a guy who's reasonably competent on repairs and rebuilding, but not very competent at all when it comes to designing circuits. On my bench today are a couple of MDS data radios, and I'm leveraging the new tool that George introduced me to. It's a Hacko desoldering tool. I talk about it a lot because it truly is amazing. And I'm working my way very gingerly around 1208 SMD components to desolder some inductors because a core got cracked, and taking away from a donor radio, and I'll replace them into a production radio, and our club can get another radio on the air.
Okay, for the listeners, you keep referring to George. George is sort of the host of the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, which we advertise on this podcast every week. And you're now one of the regulars on the podcast, so we mention you every week as well. Then in terms of these tools, I'll refer everyone to the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, where I think you guys had a whole episode, I think in November, talking about tools and things for, what you'd want as your stocking stuffer.
Yeah, we have a lot of fun with that episode because invariably Rod Hardman, VA30N, a dear friend of mine, I've known Rod for decades. He will come out and talk about screwdrivers made in Germany or whatever it is. And we all have a whole bunch of lighthearted fun bantering about which wire cutters are better and things like that. At the end of the day, just get some good quality tools and get started. My dad trained me well with tools. He said, Vincent, buy the best tool you can afford at the time.
I think your father was very wise. I tell my children that a tool becomes part of your hand, and so you want to have the best tool you can afford. I think all the tools that I have, I've had, for the most part, I've had them since I was a teenager. I'm no longer a teenager, so they can last quite a long time.
My favorite multimeter I owned since I was in high school, and a year and a half ago, it passed away. It was a B&K precision multimeter. It remained accurate until its final day, and it was beyond economic repair. Some of the parts were unobtainium. And then see my prior comments about lack of design skills. So it just seemed easier at that time to pick up a fluke meter to replace it. I was very sad with that day, though, because that meter had survived 45 years of bouncing around in my tool bag.
What's interesting is you can still buy the Simpson 260 brand new. That meter is probably, 70 years old? I think it was post-war.
It's got to be. I mean, how many of us in North America didn't have one of those on our bench in high school to learn with?
My high school had a whole cupboard full of them. Every high school in America did.
Yeah, they did. And I don't own an analog meter. All my meters are all digital. So I live with that limitation. But my fluke field meter, a 117 is RMS. So I don't have to worry about inaccuracies digitally. My 8010 bench meter isn't. So if I need to double check something, I'll pull out my field meter. And life is simple.
You mentioned that you also build kits. What kind of kits do you build?
I build kits to make my shack a better place. And so what's lined up in the queue waiting to be built right now is a pocket keyer based on the K3NG design. It came out of Japan. He does not ship them internationally. He told me he would ship them to me on the condition that if it doesn't arrive, this is not his problem, and I accepted it on that condition. So a bit of an experiment for both of us, really, he says. It's the size of a Frisk pocket mint holder. So in inches, as I grab a ruler, it'll be 3 inches by 1.5 inches by about 3/4 of an inch thick. And that'll go in my Go kit so that I have a K3NG keyer for the few times I wish to attempt to do bad CW when I'm glamping. So that's my next kit. I built some kits from KC90N. He has great kits, and they're so well laid out, and they're so well documented. I think I was building a Heath kit to look at John's instructions. And I built an audio limiting filter and a keyer, which I used until I sold off my old Kenwood TS130S before I replaced it with a Yaesu 450, which has all of these modern conveniences built in. But the audio limiting filter was awesome to narrow into a signal, and it was usable with voice as well, based on the way the skirts were designed in the passband.
What's the current rig?
A Yaesu 450D, nice and simple. I have a very high noise level here at my house, so spending tens of thousands of dollars on a really good receiver, frankly, would be wasted money here.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Now, you mentioned that you also listen to SDR. Are you listening to remote SDRs as well as what's coming in your earbuds so that you can actually, maybe hear from a place that might have a superior location but less noise?
Both local and remote, not at the same time. I have two SDR play here. Typically when I'm listening in my left ear and my right ear to two different sources, one of them is a remote SDR. I'll do net control at certain times of the year on 80 meters for the Alberta Public Service net. So we blanket all of Western Canada with our net. And there's a remote station from VE6JY about 4.5 hours north of me. As we joke, his location is so quiet that we can hear a bird break wind. And so he gives a low latency SDR IP address out to net controllers, and we can listen in both ears, if you will, and get the best of both worlds. Yeah, it's great fun.
But do you think that's becoming more of a way that people are getting past the noise issues that they may have in their QTHs?
It is for some. I think it's a relatively undiscovered world. People haven't explored websdr.org or, insert your favorite website here. To do that remote listening, it doesn't occur to them. In Canada, to operate a remote station, to operate a remote transmitter, I'll be clear, the regulations state that you must be advanced class. In America, you can be technician class, for example, so that's a significant difference in the licenses. But you can be any class and use a remote receiver. The delay is under a second, and so it wouldn't allow for fast-paced conversation. But certainly if you wanted to have a nice chat with somebody and they could hear you, I don't think it's cheating if you use somebody else's receiver.
Do you move the same radio into the car, or do you actually have something else?
I have radios in my vehicle. My full complement of rigs is Yaesu 88 or 8900, Yaesu 857D, the 450 in my shack, a number of handhelds, an FT5, a Hytera PD362, and then I have some MaxTrack and Kenwood TK705s in my fleet as I maintain repeaters or use them for digital modes. In my vehicle, it's an 8900 and an 857. In my Go kit, it's an 8800 and an 857. I tend to stick with those radios that I know. So there's an 8900 here in my shack that used to be mobile, and it went out for repair, and it's my oldest dual band radio, so it stays in the shack rather than bouncing it around on the road. At one time, I did mount an 857 and an 8900 on an aluminum plate with a grounding lug and BNC connectors and Anderson power poles, and I moved it between my house and my vehicle, my two different vehicles, because I had a pickup truck that I pulled a trailer with. But as time went on and I was able to afford a little more, I was able to dedicate radios to each of those locations.
What's your involvement with WRTC?
Well, I do net control for the regional and the national level rally sport here in Western Canada. I love the sound of an engine racing by. I always have enjoyed it. In my younger days, I raced go-karts, so I've got a bit of an adrenaline junkie in me. I used to downhill ski too, but as I've gotten older, those things fall by the wayside. I still get a thrill hearing the sound of a car goes by your position as I'm operating blocker, or maybe I'm operating a stage control as a radio guy. More and more often lately, I am in event logistics, given the number of years of experience I have now working radio at that sport. So that's my involvement with it.
Well, I think we're talking about a different one, but let's stay on the rally sport for a minute. Is that something unique to your neck of the woods, or are amateur radio operators actively involved in a lot of car racing and I just never knew about it?
They are very involved in a lot of car racing. They are needed for all points of control due to the high speed of the motorsport, and the safety element required, and the logistics coordination.
So if it's a cross-country vehicle race or something like that, then hams would be involved. Is this unique to Canada, or do you know anything about North America?
It is around the world. Rally sport is around the world. Very big in Finland and Sweden, in Japan, in Australia, North and South America. I'm sure it's everywhere.
That's an opportunity then for hams that are thinking that they'd like to do some events and may not know that, in fact, they could be quite useful for a car race at some point.
For sure. And most hams who start volunteering, they get involved in a 5-kilometer, 10-kilometer fun race or foot race, or a 100-kilometer relay race, or a cycle tour, or those sorts of things. And those events are satisfying and fun on their own. But for adrenaline junkies like me, rally sport is really a whole nother level, and it's a whole lot of fun, and we're incredibly reliant upon the radio amateur community. In those events where the radio amateurs aren't involved, rally race organizers get to train people on the use of commercial radios and people that don't use radios all the time, and it becomes a logistics challenge for sure.
Yeah, I think we forget that as amateur radio operators that we actually know how to use radios in general, and that probably the majority of the people that are not in ham radio or who are not in public safety are not used to using radios. So even something as simple as putting an antenna on a portable or changing the battery could be a big deal.
It is a big deal for these people. I often tell people that as a ham radio operator, I figure out how to get a message from point A to point B given the situation. I may elect to use my cell phone. I may elect to have, in my case, somebody else do the CW. I may elect to use any one of a number of means. It's up to me to get that message from point A to point B, and I'll use whatever means I have to, depending on the situation.
How active is the Amateur Radio Club in Okotoks?
We have a tremendous number of licensed hams here in Okotoks. It's a population of 30,000, and I think we have per capita probably more hams than in many major centers. That said, there are about 10 active hams in Okotoks, and in the wider foothills region that our club covers, we have 50 active members, 25 of whom come from the city of Calgary, because our repeater network covers into that area. The repeater network that we manage, which is our primary club activity, covers some 40 to 45,000 square kilometers of southern Alberta with a full-time linking repeater network. We're adding a data backbone onto it for management of our repeater devices. And we are building out packet infrastructure to support WinLink. This area is prone to floods, as we had a significant event in 2013 that disrupted 100,000 people in the city of Calgary and 13,000 people in the town of High River south of us. So we try to make sure our infrastructure is ready for all of those things.
Are the hams that are there, the 30 from Calgary and the 10 that you've got in Okotoks, are you guys ready for these emergencies? Do you spend a lot of time on training and stuff like that?
We hold our own. When push comes to shove, people show up in droves, and we manage with who is there. There are ARES units or disaster communications units that rehearse and practice far more than we do. Is the dirty secret.
The dirty secret is the practice?
The dirty secret is that we could practice more than we do, but at the end of the day, the job is done to the satisfaction of the agencies we serve.
And how many of organized events do you have a year in the Calgary area?
One could participate in up to a dozen events if one wanted to. At one time I did. I'm probably back down to about half of that pre-pandemic. Work doesn't allow me to take all the time off that I want to, of course, to go off and do these things. Something about still having to pay some bills and being responsible to an employer and such, right?
So when I asked you about WRTC, I was actually talking about the World Radio Sport team in Italia in 2022. Your name appears to be on a list, and I don't know if that list means that you're actually going or whether you're still trying to qualify. What's happening there?
I don't know anything about this.
Really? I'll send you the link because it looks like you have 2 qualification points. And I don't know how many you need in order to be...
Wow. You might have just introduced me to another one of the 1,000 things that Ham Radio does.
This is where they have like 10 teams. They set them up across the land, wherever that land is, with a tent and identical antennas, and you have to hook it all up and work for the weekend.
Sounds like an activity I'd get interested in.
Now, it says you have 2 qualification points, but the best score is 610,000 points. So I think if you're going to go this year, you're going to have to get on the air more.
I might just have to do that. Oh, I see this now as I do Google as we talk. I have no idea.
I found a list that you didn't know you were on.
There's probably a few of them.
What is the fake ham lid net?
The fake ham lid net is the most un-ham net that a guy can participate in. It's a DMR group. We meet on Thursday nights at 21:30 Eastern Time. I can't do the conversion fast enough to Zulu. On Brandmeister Talk Group 98003, we must obey all rules of the amateur radio service. But at the end of the day, we get on and we poke fun at all those things we love to hate about ham radio. What's ruining ham radio this week? What is your medical ailment this week? And if you had to choose between orange and black, which would you choose? No context. We think of silly questions to ask each other, mostly to make each other laugh and smile. And that's what the fake ham lid net is all about.
And we could do a lot more of that.
We could. We certainly.
What is a problem that ham radio is having right now that you would poke fun at?
Oh, a problem that I'd poke fun at on the fake ham lid net. I wasn't prepared for that question, Eric. A problem that we're having is that the speeds of CW are too darn high, and they need to be brought down to 7 words a minute so that everybody can participate. That would be my fake ham lid net answer.
Now, I understand that you drag around a Montana 3400 RL fifth wheel trailer around Canada and the USA. How does that mesh with ham radio?
It allows me to build my portable operating chops. Everybody's going to sit there and listen. So what's a Montana 3400? So it's a 40-foot long fifth wheel. It requires a 1-ton truck to pull it around, especially in the mountains. And they're going, well, that's not portable.
It's pretty luxurious, too, from what I can see.
It's lovely inside. It really is. And it's my speed of glamping. glamorous camping and my wife's speed and our dog's speed anymore. We used to do tent camping and car camping, and we had a motorcycle trailer that we pulled behind a small car at one point. Anyway, we worked our way to this rig, and this is what we like to do. But it really lets me rehearse setting up my Go Kit in a park setting and operating for whatever length of time we are there. It gives me an excuse to build something that meets my need of wanting to set up quickly and yet as efficiently as possible. That's what I do with it. I have a wonderful inverted V or a flat top dipole if I can find enough trees, a great 30-foot mast, and it all lives in the trailer. I removed the telephone line pass-through because what's a landline? Nobody uses those anymore, especially in camping in parks. And I built a set of 3 cables to do feed line pass-through into an operating position inside on a desk. My Go Kit fits very nicely on that desk. And I can operate portable from there or from my picnic table.
We will return to our guests in just a moment. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. Nowadays, it seems to me that if you're out in a luxurious camper like this, that you also need to have an internet connection. Do you have a satellite internet connection yet, or do you have LTE? What does the internet portion of that look like?
I don't feel an overwhelming need to have an internet connection, so I don't have one. If I'm in a range where my cell phone supports it, then it's LTE, but I don't need the internet to talk on the radio or to listen to. We're frequently in the Rocky Mountains, given our proximity, to listen to people doing SOTA activities. They're generally on the air between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. local time on Simplex 146.52, and then I can ask them what HF frequency they're on. If I really feel a need to squeeze out an email, well, that's why I've got WinLink Packet to go in a little Pelican case that accompanies my Go Kit, or I can do it on Vera HF if I really have to get something out. No, when I go camping, I don't tend to care about the internet very much.
I'm really impressed, actually, because I would think that as a technologist that you would actually want to take it along with you, even on vacation. Good for you.
If I can, I will.
I wish I could exercise so much self-control.
If I can, I will, but it depends on where we're going and when we're going. If I'm going away for 3 or 4 days and I'm concerned about staying in touch, then I'll choose a campground that has such services. But if not, I don't worry about it. Of course, with a 40-foot trailer, I don't fit into all the campsites that are available to me, so I have to regrettably be choosy. Life was simpler when we had a camper that fit in the back of our pickup truck, and I could pull into any old stall anywhere. But as we age, our knees aren't as good, and so we have the Glamper. And
do you find other hams on the road when you're out traveling around in the Glamper? Do you find other hams?
Sure. When one sets up a 30-foot mast with a collinear VHF UHF antenna on the top and an inverted V with 3 elements on it, one tends to attract a lot of attention. And I was camping in southern British Columbia a couple of years ago, and a guy walked up to me and he sticks out his hand and he says, "Hey," I can't remember his name or his call sign. "Hi, I'm Bob, VE7ABC." And that's how he introduced himself to me. He immediately knew that I was a ham. Of course, it's hard to not spot my truck, the Porcupine, parked in front of my trailer. But, people come up and they say, "What's that big antenna doing?" "Oh, well, I don't know, talking to a guy up in Alaska, half an hour ago." And they're interested. And so you can begin this wonderful dialogue with people too, right? It's kind of like a little public engagement thing.
Is there something that we could be doing better to attract a non-ham public to amateur radio?
I don't think I'm prepared with an answer for that. I don't really know. We should always have our best foot forward when somebody approaches us about our hobby, because people will say things to us trying to get a rise out of us or not really understanding. Somebody said, "Y'all can talk to Mars with that thing?" I've had that question a couple of times. Or when crossing the border, the Customs and Border Patrol in the U.S., he sees my great big Webster band spanner on the back of the little tiny 4x4 I owned at the time. The antenna was taller than the vehicle, as you can appreciate. And he says, "Y'all can talk to Art Bell on that thing." The public have they have an idea of what it's about, but they really don't know. And so it's imperative that we are gentle in our answer. They really don't care why we got into it. They want to know what you can do with it. And so if we can answer that question in plain old kitchen English, then it'll go a long way.
Yeah, Art Bell was my guest on the QSO Today podcast a number of years ago. Regrettably, Art has since passed on. And so anyone talking to Art now, we'd probably want to know what kind of radio that is.
Yeah, we would.
We would. It's my understanding that you're also a PADI certified scuba diver. I am too. Does amateur radio, can you combine that with scuba diving?
I haven't found a way to do that yet. I mean, my VX7 is submersible, but I've never tried it.
Well, I'm assuming that you're not scuba diving in Calgary. Maybe you are. But if you're headed to the Caribbean, do you take radios with you for scuba diving expeditions?
No, I don't. When I tend to go to the Caribbean, it's into Mexico, and the licensing scene in Mexico, in my humble opinion, is mixed up. Locals are having trouble getting a ticket. Expats can't get a ticket. So no, I leave all of that gear at home. We take out SIM cards at the local store and plug them into our cell phones to stay in touch with each other as a group. It's amazing, though, the number of scuba divers that are also hams. And I attribute that to, as I phrase it, it's a gearhead hobby. Or in the case of scuba, it's a gearhead sport. You know, we will wax poetically about our the pressures that our first stage regulator can handle, and the size of the battery in our dive computer, and the best silicone sealant to wrap around an O-ring to keep our cameras from having water ingress. And if any of these things sound like the best way to crimp a connector onto coax, now listeners are going, "Well, Vince, you don't crimp a connector, you solder it." That's my point exactly. There are so many different things, and there are so many overlaps between the two, and they, in my mind, require kind of the same sort of thinking to be very self-sufficient in the sport or in the hobby, as the case would be.
Maybe being a ham makes you a different diver, because I think that most people that are diving on vacation, for example, dive maybe a few times a year at the most, and so they don't pay a lot of attention to the equipment that they're using. But as a ham radio operator, because you're kind of equipment-centered, then as a scuba diver, you also may pay more attention to equipment than most of the people who are PADI certified.
Could well be the case. As a ham radio operator, I made it 18 years until I got my first RF burn, for example. So, you know, it's drilled into our heads as we educate others, as we are educated. Thou shalt not touch a wire while a transmitter is on. And well, so I made it 18 years before I kind of forgot about that rule. Fortunately, it was only 8 watts on VHF, but I'll never forget my first RF burn. In a similar way, I thought I would have tremendous anxiety under the column of water, as a scuba divers refer to it, at depth, with all that water above me. I thought I'd be claustrophobic. The reverse is true, but you must be incredibly self-reliant to solve your problems. For me, that means knowing intimately how my gear works, how to assemble it, how to disassemble it, how to do basic repair on it. Exactly the same as I am with radio.
From your perspective, Vince, what do you think is the greatest challenge facing amateur radio now?
There's this, I want to call it recent, and recent is a relative term. How long's ham radio been around? 100 years more? There's this recent explosion of the convergence of technology and radio, and I think it's creating challenges for people who are trying to stay caught up. A few people know that I part-time at a candy store, and the candy is all those radios that we love to buy and such. So I get to help people spend their money and achieve their hobby goals in ham radio, which is a fun job. But people come in to me with questions about, so what do I need to do FT8? They hear about FT8, the latest thing. What do I need to do FT8? And I said, oh, well, you need a sound card, or you need an interface, or whatever the widget is. And they say, oh, well, I think I have one of those now. And they name off, a Signal Link or a Rig Blaster or whatever. I used to do RTTY. Is that like the same gear? People struggle with the rate of change and trying to understand all those things that are getting involved or that are happening and learning what all those different things are. I think that right now, the convergence of SDR built into, one of the radios that's on your desk, external SDR, the way that computing affects these things, the resurgence in interest in WinLink is baffling to people. It's all this rate of change of the convergence of different technologies into what has traditionally been, in my view, a relatively stable sort of set of technology and hobby. In the last 20 years, it's just exploded, and people struggle to keep up.
On QRZ, I see conversations that people have with each other over the traditional AM single sideband CW versus the thousands of other things now that are in ham radio. I think it could be disconcerting for someone who's been a single sideband rag chewer for 80 years.
Or a guy who's sat there with his Vibraplex key and he only operates CW. And he's like, all these guys, all my friends at Coffee are talking about this FT8 thing. What the heck is that? Or JS8 call. A friend of mine, he loved doing CW. He recently got out of the hobby as he had competing hobbies, astronomy, Raspberry Pi, all these other things. And apparently there's quite a cross-section of hams who are into astronomy. I guess I'm one of the few that isn't. Notwithstanding, he loved raging at 15 words a minute. And I introduced him to digital modes, and he bought a little sound card just not long before he sold off all of his gear. And he loved JS8 call because it was about the same pace as 15 word a minute CW. And it gave him something new to play with. And so he had a tremendous time with that. But yeah, people struggle to keep up. I really think that's the biggest challenge hitting us right now.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Exactly the same thing. The explosion of the technology and the convergence of it. The convergence of computing and radio. The concept of a radio on a chip. DRA818 modules. Don't ask me how to integrate one. I don't know, but I'm smart enough to recognize that it's a radio on a chip, and you throw a few potentiometers around it and connectors and add some power to it, and apparently you've got a radio. That excites me because of the potential to build it into items that people would want to use. The way that we have so many different bits of software to drive our radios to allow us to communicate in ways that open the doors up to more people to be able to communicate and the application of it. And so I'll never be a proficient CW contester, although I shouldn't say never. I'm far better at digital modes, and digital modes will get through most of the time. We're more so than voice modes will in poor conditions. CW trumps all. Many of us believe that. Anyway, the convergence of all these technologies allowing me to harness just a few watts and get a signal out, I find that rather exciting. And sure enough, a number of my little projects that I find myself working on, I involve playing with all of these bits and pieces.
One of the things that it seems to me that reinforces this idea that ham radio is alive and well, in fact, really strong, is that you have all of these companies that are coming out with all these new radios, or all these companies that are making electronic kits. So it's kind of like we're in this renaissance of new gear, new technology. It's really exciting.
It is. It is very exciting. One day I'll get brave enough and maybe I'll buy a transceiver kit and build that up. I don't know. We'll see where it goes. Maybe after I retire in 20 years.
You still have to have your eyes so you can wind all those coils.
Exactly.
All those toroids.
Exactly.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
The same advice I give to those who just wrote a test when they sit with me. Congratulations, you've earned a license to learn. So you've earned the right to further your learning. Ham radio is a hobby of 1,000 hobbies. Try all of the things. Get involved. Don't just use it for one purpose. There's a whole big world out there. All you have to do is open your mind to the possibilities and open your eyes to what's around you, and you'll see that you can have a lot of fun with this in a variety of different ways. Indeed, I got into the hobby, as I joke, the House Finance Approval Committee, that would be my wife. I got into the hobby without budget. And I said to my wife, I want to get into this, and I want to volunteer, because she was very big into volunteering. And that was the thin edge of the wedge, as the expression goes. Boy, when I got into it, I discovered there's a whole heck of a lot more than doing radio position at a foot race or a rally. And I'm having the time of my life with it.
Vince, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I really appreciate your saying yes and coming on. This is the second day of the new year. Usually people are busy or they're busy cleaning up, and I'm glad that you took some time today to speak with me on QSO Today.
Eric, it's my absolute pleasure and my honor to be here. Thank you so much.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Vince. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in VE6LK in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.